England has collapsed politically and economically. Fellow leaders let rip as a lonely David Cameron arrives in Brussels with vital British interests under threat.
You know, when I came here 17 years ago, you all laughed at me. Well, I have to say, you're not laughing now, are you?
The British people voted in favour of the exit. Why are you here?
Extraordinary scenes both in the European Parliament and amongst the leaders of the 28 nations, which could come back to haunt us. Good evening from Brussels, where a humble David Cameron was left plaintive in his plea for a relationship that suits both sides, while UKIP leader Nigel Farage had a very different negotiating attitude as he rubbed salt into the wounds of MEPs who will vote to ratify Britain's future deal with Europe.
While we're leaving the European Union, we mustn't be turning our backs on Europe. These countries are our neighbours, our friends, our allies, our partners.
As Angela Merkel takes a hard line, there is some division here about making Britain pay and being more accommodating. And closer to home, a standing ovation from the Scottish nationalists for Europe to protect the Scots from the Brexiteers in England.
I want my country to be Scotland. Did not let you down. Please, I beg you, chers collègues, do not let Scotland down now.
Also tonight here in Westminster, the political collapse continues as over 80% of Labour MPs vote against Jeremy Corbyn.
Seamus, I'm not sure this is a great idea. We getting the camera to go? Right?
He just manages to refill his shadow cabinet with most of the last 40 MPs to support him, as 172 Labour MPs vote for him to resign. He clings on. Osborne, far from contrite, and with his grand projects HS2, Hinckley, as well as Port Talbot under threat, he says he wants to stay in post, but admits he cannot run to succeed Cameron.
No, bro, I'll waste you, I'll waste anyone.
19? And amid dozens of reported racist incidents across the UK, we talk to the American victim of this on a Manchester tram today.
Another day, more uncertainty. The focus shifted to Brussels and the EU summit. David Cameron arrived to state we're leaving the EU but not turning our backs on Europe. In the European Parliament, Nigel Farage was jeered but told MEPs, you're not laughing now. And a Scottish MEP was cheered as he begged his European colleagues not to let Scotland down. It may have been politics on the surface, but underneath there's a sense of anger after the biggest single shock to the European political system since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
You know when people are commiserating. Pats on the back, shakes of the head, a hug from the Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi. Tonight, David Cameron is telling the other 27 leaders where it went wrong and how he hopes Britain can have the closest possible relationship with the club it's leaving after 43 years.
Well, good afternoon. I'll be explaining that Britain will be leaving the European Union, but I want that process to be as constructive as possible, and I hope the outcome can be as constructive as possible, because, of course, while we're leaving the European Union, we mustn't be turning our backs on Europe. These countries are our neighbours, our friends, our allies, our partners, and I very much hope we'll seek the closest possible relationship in terms of trade and cooperation and security, because that is good for us and that is good for them. And that's the spirit in which the discussions, I think, will be held today.
It'll be his successor that moves Article 50 of the treaties, which means formally applying to leave the EU. Some leaders said the Brexit vote was already destroying the UK.
While the UK is in disarray politically, financially, economically and constitutionally, it would be out of the question to demand that they enact Article 50 straight away.
I think that mentally, psychologically, Brexit already is in place because of vote and because it was proposed in the first place, because of ambitions of few politicians, and country became a hostage of these ambitions.
David Cameron joined the others for his last summit photo. But soon 27 will be on one side of a table negotiating with Britain alone on the other. Hard bargaining will start. Chancellor Merkel said there could be no cherry-picking of EU laws, taking free trade, for instance, and dropping free movement. Their biggest fear is contagion, others following Britain with their own in-out votes.
Do you think British voters should be punished now to make an example of them so others don't follow suit?
Silly questions. Obviously not.
So you're going to make
it's democracy at work. We're not punishing anyone.
Sorry? We'll get a nice deal then.
Well, if you want to leave, you leave. And then you start talking about how your future relationship will be shaped.
Aren't you worried about contagion if other people think you get a nice deal when you leave?
No, I think everybody looking to the markets, to the turbulences around the currency, to the downgrading of the rating agency, the United Kingdom downgrade by Standard & Poor's. This was unthinkable 6-7 days ago.
This morning at the European Parliament emergency debate on Brexit, the man whose surge in support terrified David Cameron into having a referendum led the applause when Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker acknowledged Britain's vote was final.
Democracy is democracy, and we must respect it. We must respect British democracy and the way it has voiced its view. That's the last time you are applauding here.
He asked why Nigel Farage was still in Brussels. You might have guessed, to gloat.
Isn't it funny? You know, when I came here 17 years ago, and I said that I wanted to lead a campaign to get Britain to leave the European Union, you all laughed at me. Well, I have to say, you're not laughing now, are you? And the reason you're so upset, the reason you're so angry, has been perfectly clear from all the angry exchanges this morning. You, as a political project, are in denial.
The leader of France's Front National, Marine Le Pen, said she rejoiced at Britain's vote. It was a slap in the face for Europe. The SNP said Europe must give Scotland a way back in.
But please remember this. Scotland did not let you down. Please, I beg you, chers collègues, do not let Scotland down now.
Nigel Farage thinks some are already plotting to dilute the sort of break he wants from Europe. Exit talks will be a protracted series of trade-offs. Anything but straightforward.
If we can escape, we will.
Well, Gary Gibbon joins me now. Gary, the last time we stood in this room, in this hall, was in February when David Cameron hailed his deal that was going to save Britain's membership in the EU. That really does seem like ancient history now. But tell us, what was going on here today?
Another piece of ancient history was December, when we were here a bit before that, and he sat in front of the European Council members. They were all nervous about how the referendum was going to go, and he said, "Don't worry, I'm a winner." Some of them remember that very dearly. What is going on here is obviously in many ways momentous, in other ways not much, because David Cameron, as we've said before, is a zombie prime minister. That's a phrase of one of his own cabinet ministers, by the way. He doesn't have a mandate from the British people to negotiate what comes next. There is this power void, and he's here slightly going through the motions of being still a sort of member of the European Union, and giving a report back to the European Union about why he thinks he lost the referendum.
But no notification of
No
Article
notification. 50. I'm not sure the report back will go down particularly well, because he'll be telling them this problem you've got with freedom of movement won't go away until you deal with it, and there's very little appetite in there to do anything of that kind.
So amidst all the sound and fury that we heard today on the doorstep just behind us, was there any inkling at all of what any deal might actually look like?
Well, you get a bigger picture talking to Conservative candidates for the leadership and their teams, people around government, about what they think is the outline of a plausible shape of a deal, and it tends to be you try and get as much access to the single market as you possibly can, trading it a bit for some restriction on freedom of movement. And the thing is, all this sounds perfectly plausible to some people, actually not plausible to Nigel Farage, who wants a lot more on freedom of movement. But in here, still, there is no movement on freedom of movement. There was talk during our referendum in Berlin and other capitals about how perhaps over time they might have to rethink moving back from freedom of peoples to move to freedom of labour, maybe rethinking things, but they seem to be moving at an incredibly glacial pace, and there's every sign that it will not move fast enough for the deal that a lot of people in Britain, I think, would quite like to see.
And tomorrow they'll be talking behind David Cameron's back because he won't be invited.
There'll be many more of those meetings, 27, one not there.
Gary, thank you very much indeed. Well, of course, here in Brussels, access to the single market comes with a big condition, the free movement of people, as Gary just said. And any hopes that the UK can have one without the other have been dashed by the German Chancellor today. For Britain, she says, there will be no special favours. We started our day in Berlin, and so did Angela Merkel. She was inside the Reichstag, where the inscription reads, Dem deutschen Volke, to the German people. And that's who she was addressing directly today in a speech lathered with reassurances that Britain would not be getting any favourable treatment.
This means, first of all, that we cannot let one state jeopardise all the achievements of the European Union forged by the other 27. We will ensure that negotiations will not permit any British cherry-picking.
Every leader came to Brussels today packing at least some of their own national interest. Some were also more motivated than others by self-preservation. President Hollande wants to usher Britain out of the door as fast as possible.
Europe has made its voice heard. Now the United Kingdom must issue a notification to leave the European Union so we can organise things calmly, in the interest of the United Kingdom, but above all, in the interest of Europe. And I'm confident that there is no time to waste, because all eyes are on us. We are here, not just Europeans, the international press have their eyes on us. We have to take our responsibilities. It is strong enough to act, and to act in its own interest.
The political leaders weren't the only visitors in town. We came across Caroline McCall, the CEO of EasyJet, the airline that arguably has most to gain and most to lose from Europe. Your airline embodies the entity of Europe in terms of transport, being able to fly open skies, being able to fly from, I don't know, Riga to Berlin or
anywhere.
Anywhere, exactly.
Anywhere.
So what happens to that now?
I think that remains. To be absolutely honest with you, nothing has fundamentally changed. So we are still in the EU, that's number one. Nothing changes for quite a long time, actually. Secondly, we will always be able to do that because if we can't stay in the single EU market for aviation, which I think all airlines in Europe want to stay in, then we will have an EU AOC, which is an entity in the EU, which would give us those flying rights.
But would you move your headquarters to, I don't know, to Dublin or to Frankfurt?
That remains to be seen.
But you're thinking of all those scenarios.
We have to think of all the scenarios.
You represent one of the most high-profile and successful British businesses. Mm-hmm. What is your message to the politicians who are currently AWOL in London?
Well, I mean, my message would be we need to see some certainty and some clarity very quickly, because actually we need that for Britain. You know, we need that stability, because that will bring about economic stability. It will make people feel an awful lot better. It will make people feel much more confident.
When will you get that certainty?
Well, I don't know. You know, we have to wait and see.
Off to the flea market in a grungier part of Brussels, a place brimming with bargain memories. The politicians may be venting over Brexit, but here I found mainly bereavement and anxiety.
The whole continent is finished.
The whole continent is finished?
Yes,
Why do you say that?
Because Brexit.
Maybe once Britain does it, maybe others will follow. It's the first sort of step in who knows what the future
That's tragic,
will be.
Isn't it?
It's tragic, I feel, yes.
Ismail from Cameroon is a Belgian citizen who told me that he was afraid that Brexit had opened the door to more xenophobia and more racism. Everyone is in uncharted territory. The old certainties have been discarded like unwanted suitcases. And the next few weeks and months will decide just who this dismembered mannequin represents. Well, to reflect on what we've seen and indeed heard today in Brussels and the United Kingdom is the leader of UKIP, Nigel Farage. So you told the members of the European Parliament that you had the last laugh, they're not laughing now, and that they'd never done a decent day's work in their life. These are the people that have to sign off on any kind of deal that the British government manages to cobble together with them. And that was ridiculous what you did, wasn't
Well,
it?
let's get a sense of perspective, shall we? I stood up to speak. I was, before I'd uttered a word, shouted down twice in my speech. The President of the Parliament had to halt proceedings and say, please listen to him.
But this is about the national interest. Why are you shouting? Why are you dealing with people like that who need to sign off on a deal that is essential for our nation?
As I say, let's get a sense of perspectives. They were rude, abusive, shouted me down, and I teased them back a little bit.
So you were rude back to them.
No,
but unfortunately, we need those people to sign off on a deal.
I wasn't rude, I teased them. But I was trying to make a very serious point, and here it is. We are now going into a renegotiation. The argument I put to them was, let's be grown up and sensible about it. Let's recognise that in terms of trade, if there was a tariff barrier war between us, it would hurt them more than us.
What is grown up about telling people they've never done a decent day's work in their life when you need those people politically later down the road?
Well, when you try and make an argument in reasonable terms, as I've just done to you, and all they do is barrack and scream abuse, perhaps sometimes you come back with a little retort. But I do repeat the point. There are hundreds of thousands of German car workers' jobs utterly reliant on selling product into the United Kingdom. So let's have this conversation.
But were you acting in the national interest when you stood up and said those things? Because
I've been told.
The feeling in the chamber was very much against
I've been told I've been acting against the national interest for the last 20 years by even daring to suggest we should not be members of the European Union. We've had a referendum, we've voted to leave, it's now about having sensible terms of divorce.
Okay, let's talk about something that's happening, something alarming that's happening in the UK. The instances of racial abuse, of people who think that the Brexit vote somehow gives them the license to be abusive to other Europeans, to people outside the European Union, mentioning the P word again after God knows how many years. Will you condemn that?
Utterly, as I always have done. I mean, look, UKIP has always been a party that respects the rule of law and that is completely against extremism or discrimination, of course. And you know something? I will say this to you, that the abuse since that Brexit result is going both ways, because there are people who voted to leave who are being called horrible things. We're in a country of heightened tensions.
But some people think that they have been given a license to indulge in racial abuse because of the vote.
I think those people behaved like that before and would have behaved like that regardless of what the result is. And I condemn appalling behaviour on both sides of any argument.
But the instances of that abuse have gone up dramatically, according to the police.
Well, perhaps they have, perhaps they haven't. I don't know.
So what will you say to those people? To those people watching you right now, what would you say to them?
Behave yourselves. We are living in the 21st century. We're living in a global world. We're living in a country that has, for 60 years, had people from the Commonwealth and elsewhere come to settle within it. And we will go on being a country that is open and welcoming. The difference is, having voted for Brexit, we can now control the numbers.
Jean-Claude Juncker said you should quit the European Parliament, hand back your expenses. Are you going to do that?
Well, do you know what? We've won the war in winning this referendum. We now have to win the peace. And the whole negotiation that will take place here and be debated and voted on in the European Parliament is something that I, as leader of the biggest British group in the European Parliament, have to take part in.
There are reports tonight, quite credible reports, that there might be a deal, if Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister, that his Foreign Secretary will be George Osborne. Michael Gove at number 11. Do you feel that you're being cut out of a deal that you helped to create?
Well, I don't care about me being personally cut out of a deal. Let me tell you what I do care about. 17.5 million people, the largest number who've ever voted for anything in the United Kingdom, voted to get our country back and get our borders back. And what matters to me is that the government holds faith with those voters.
But you're not even sitting at the table.
Well, I'm not part of the government, but that doesn't matter. What matters is they do what people want and they don't backslide when it comes to the free movement of people.
Nigel Farage, thank you very much. Well, that's it from Brussels for now. We'll see you later on, but let's go to John in Westminster. John.
Well, here the deepening chaos deepens further. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has lost a vote of no confidence in his leadership by 172 MPs to 40. But he won't be resigning. In an emailed statement, he says the vote has no constitutional legitimacy and that he isn't about to betray those who elected him last year. For there to be a leadership, there has to be at least 50 Labour MPs uniting around an alternative candidate to set the wheels in motion. Here's our political correspondent, Michael Crick.
Can I say, colleagues, thank you very much for...
Jeremy Corbyn met his new shadow cabinet for the first time today. Almost two-thirds of them fresh faces, though he soon regretted inviting the cameras in.
Seamus, I'm not sure this is a great idea.
This must have been an excruciatingly difficult day for the Labour leader. At 4:30 came the result. By 172 votes to 40, a margin of more than 4 to 1, his MPs declared they had no confidence in him.
I think this has been a devastating result for Jeremy Corbyn, and it's absolutely clear that the Parliamentary Labour Party, over 80% of them, have no confidence in his leadership going forward, have no confidence in his ability to win a general election.
I think Jeremy should do exactly what he wants to do. He has a huge mandate, the biggest mandate in the history of our party virtually, from up to 400,000 members. 172 of my colleagues have decided they've got no confidence in him. He'll hear what they have to say, but he might want to hear what the rest of the party has to say, and he's got the right to do that as a chosen leader. And if anybody else disagrees with that, they've got the right to put the hat in the ring against him.
And now that will almost certainly happen. Tom Watson is one of 2 possible challengers being mooted tonight. Popular with the grassroots and unions, he was elected Corbyn's deputy last year. And Angela Eagle, who resigned yesterday as Shadow Business Secretary. She lost to Watson last year, but is seen as being on the left and has performed well as Corbyn's stand-in at Question Time. It's reported Watson and Eagle tonight discussed which one should stand against Corbyn.
We do need a unifying candidate to step forward, and somebody who can bring all parts of the party together, who is able to communicate within the membership of elected Labour MPs, but also to the wider membership, bring on board the trade unions as well.
The party now faces a legal row over whether Corbyn would be a candidate automatically or would need 50 or so MPs and MEPs to nominate him. Not easy given today's vote. In April, the Labour General Secretary got advice from a barrister, Mark Henderson, which we've obtained. Henderson declared,
"I do not consider that an incumbent requires nomination in order to appear on the ballot against a challenger."
He added,
"In the case of an election for leader, where there is no vacancy, the incumbent is automatically on the ballot paper along with the challengers."
Corbyn's critics claim counter-advice. But his friends cite last night's hastily arranged rally by 1,000 or so Corbyn supporters in Parliament Square as evidence he has backing from the grassroots, though many there were members of other socialist parties.
I absolutely pledge my allegiance to my leader until there is a leadership election, and if I see a better candidate in that leadership election, I might vote for them. But at the moment, there isn't one. At the moment, what we have is a Labour opposition that must do its job of opposing.
And tonight, Corbyn fights on. He's just said today's vote by MPs has, quote, no constitutional legitimacy. And he urged everyone to unite behind him at what he calls a critical time for the country.
Well, we'll talk more about Labour's troubles shortly, but incidentally, just now we've learnt that Liz McInnes, a junior shadow minister, has resigned from Corbyn's midst. Now, it's not just Labour going through the paroxysm of leadership crisis. With the Prime Minister's job up for grabs, the Tory runners and riders are starting to emerge. George Osborne won't stand, but among the maybes are Theresa May, Liam Fox, Stephen Crabb, and the bookie's favourite, Boris Johnson. Michael Crick is still with me. Michael.
Well, this is an extraordinary time, John. I don't think in British history there's ever been a time where both the government party and the main opposition party have been holding leadership elections simultaneously. And today and yesterday at Westminster, you've seen MPs. Obviously, this is a major consideration for them. And of course, nowadays, now the parties allow the ordinary members to make the final choice. They're engaged really in the black arts of the shortlist. They have to whittle the shortlist down to present to the party members, be they Conservative or Labour, and they have to be very skilled at it and try and work out who it is best to present on the shortlist to bring the result they want. Now, the Conservatives, as you were saying, obviously Theresa May and Boris Johnson are standing. Stephen Crabb has made it clear he's going to stand as well on a joint ticket with the Business Secretary, Sajid Javid. And, as you say, Jeremy Hunt, Nicky Morgan and Liam Fox are also likely to stand. Good news for Boris Johnson today. He got support from Nicholas Soames, who in recent weeks has been on the other side of the referendum and has been highly critical of Boris Johnson, although he always regards him as a lifelong friend. We also heard news that the timetable has been changed slightly. It was announced yesterday we could get a result by September the 2nd. They've now, the Conservative board say, it might be as late as September the 9th. But frankly, if the Conservative MPs manage to whittle their shortlist down to the 2 names required to put to the membership in the ballots that are expected on Tuesday and Thursday of next week, if they get it down to 2 by the end of next week, we could actually get a result and a new Prime Minister a lot earlier than September the 9th, possibly in mid-August. Who knows? The other interesting development today is this whole question about whether there's likely to be a snap election. Now, Boris Johnson, his camp were thought to favour that. Now they're making it clear that he doesn't necessarily favour a snap election. And, of course, that's the reason why there's been so much, or one of the reasons why Corbyn's critics have been on the attack, and one of the reasons why they say he has to go, because they think will do badly in such an election.
Michael Crick, you could write a book. Thank you very much.
I might do.
Yeah. Let's go back to discuss the state of the Labour Party after the no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn this afternoon. I'm joined by Labour MP Andy Slaughter, who resigned yesterday from his position as Shadow Justice Minister, Angela Rayner, the newly appointed Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities, and Alistair Campbell, the former Director of Communications for the Labour Party. And let me just start with you, Andy Slaughter, because it's interesting. You didn't decide for yourself. You went back to your constituency. Very briefly, what did you find when you asked them whether they wanted Mr Corbyn anymore?
Well, it is my decision, but I thought I ought to consult. I've had about 300 emails from party members, constituents in any event. They split about 2/3, 1/3 in favour of Jeremy going. But then the people I really wanted to talk to were my councillors who are elected, my party officers, the people who know my electorate and who work for me, and they split 10-1 in favour of Jeremy going.
And about 70 of them?
Yeah, about 70 of them.
Right, and you've decided, although you were backing Andy Burnham, a rather different figure from Jeremy Corbyn, you've decided you must do it. For why?
Well, for me, Jeremy has a mandate to lead the party at the moment, and the membership made that decision less than 12 months ago. So for me, it was about trying to bring party unity, which is not there at the moment, unfortunately, but more importantly, about steering the ship, because the government left us without a captain of the ship, out at sea, without any life jackets.
But all your
and
sailors
that's
have gone
outrageous.
overboard. All your sailors have gone overboard. I mean, this is no ship, this is a sinking tub.
Well, for me, it's about holding the government to account, and the things that I've been doing today, like I attended a pensions briefing earlier and spoke to the market about some of the real concerns, like the AAA rating that the UK has lost. So it's about holding the government to account and doing the job that I was elected to do.
Now we're into, 172-40, absolutely no confidence. They like the man, but he cannot lead.
But we knew that the Parliamentary Labour Party had a problem with Jeremy. I think that was well documented, and it's about what the party membership and the wider constituents think.
Okay,
and I think that they will get their opportunity now to have that vote.
Let's get some Labour perspective from Alistair Campbell. I mean, you wrote the tablets of stone in the early days of the Blair administration. Come down from the mountain. What do you see?
I see us heading over a cliff, unless we're very, very careful. And I certainly see a general election coming down the track, whether Boris Johnson wants one or not.
How soon?
Soon, because the country's not going to take him, especially having won a campaign on a pack of lies, suddenly comes in as Prime Minister and we just say, carry on. Don't forget, this referendum, from his perspective, was partly about saying we, the British people, should choose the people in charge of us. So he can hardly come in on the shrinking Tory membership.
But Labour would be in no shape whatever to fight such an election.
Absolutely not. We would. There's a real risk we would get absolutely wiped out. And I mean, I understand what Angela's saying, but the reality is that Jeremy Corbyn, this wasn't just about his woeful campaigning in the referendum. The people who were resigning in the last 48 hours, they have tried to make it work, and they've seen, as you were indicating, he cannot do the job. His only
as
job.
Angela Rayner says, it's not the MPs who elected him anyway, it's the party faithful.
That may be the case, but I think that if they are happy with the direction of the party, and this is becoming almost like a sect. It's about him, not the Labour Party, and the opposition has never been more needed than it is now.
Andy Slaughter, would you be prepared to nominate a successor? Are you prepared to sign nomination papers?
I'm going to wait. There are lots of very talented people who have those leadership skills.
Are you one of those people?
I'm not one of those people. In the Parliamentary Labour Party, it has lost confidence in Jeremy. I'm sorry about that, because I do think he's a good guy.
But
he's
you've
just
been
not,
in there. You've been in there long enough. You can surely say, look, I've seen 2 or 3 people who really are outstanding leaders.
you need really special skills. Alistair may have looked easy in his day. They do exist in the Parliamentary Labour Party, and for the country, as Alistair says, we do need to show that leadership. That's what's changed in the last 2 weeks.
Stick your neck out, Alistair. Who's the next leader of the Labour Party? Alan Johnson?
Listen, I would love it if people like Alan Johnson and Hilary Benn. I'd actually quite like it if David Miliband was still around, but he's not. I think there has to be a woman. I think Angela Eagle or somebody like that should probably have their hat in the ring. There are probably people that I don't know very well because I've not been in there for a time. But the reality is anything is better than this. And the thing about the other answer to your question is you never really know fully about leadership until they're in positions of leadership. And what we know, having seen Jeremy Corbyn in a position of leadership for some time, he cannot do the job.
Right.
And if he is a decent man, he should do the decent thing and go.
Angela Rayner, you've heard this conversation going on round Westminster time and time again. Something has to be done, and yet you are perhaps propping up the nothing will be done camp.
What I've been doing is listening to my constituents. I went back to my constituency, I spoke to people, and it's fair to say there are some people that are critical of Jeremy.
We're talking
I think
Stockport, Outer Manchester, etc.
We're talking Ashland Line, Tameside, Oldham.
Yeah. And they're saying they love Jeremy, they want him as their leader.
Some of them are saying that, some of them are saying absolutely not. But overwhelmingly, what they're saying is they're fed up of politicians telling them what they want. They want us to listen to them for a change, and that's what I intend to do. And if they decide that Jeremy's not going to be our leader, then that's their decision, not for me to make. I will support our democratically elected leader. A divided party, as Alistair knows, never wins elections.
Angela Rayner, Andy, thank you very much, and Alistair. There have been dozens of reports of an upsurge in race hate crime and racist graffiti since the Brexit vote. Shouts of "go home" and worse directed at people in the streets, slogans echoing that sentiment, sneakily sprayed on walls. Victims have spoken of how surprised they were that the racist comments were so aggressive. One said her neighbours told her they don't want her living in her street. There have been calls for extra vigilance from the police. Porrick O'Brien has this and a warning his report does contain some abusive language and behaviour which some viewers may find distressing.
7:40 this morning. The tram to Market Street, Manchester. The everyday backdrop makes the full abusive onslaught even more unbearable to watch.
You have. Get back to Africa. Listen, the youngins who are doing you little muppet, don't you are extremely ignorant and not very intelligent. You know that? Get off the tram now. Get off the tram now. Get off the tram then.
A group of 3 young men turn on Juan Hasso, a university lecturer from America, after he confronts them for using foul language.
What are you, 16? Get off with the bottle up here. 7 years in the military.
7 years in the US Army, made of tough stuff, visibly shaken. The crowd turn on the men as they leave the tram.
You can please, you can go.
This afternoon, Manchester police arrested 3 young men on suspicion of a fray. Again, the question today, is this type of incident more likely to have happened post the referendum result? Manchester police have not reported an increase in hate crimes. The Met in London, where this Polish centre was targeted, also have not reported an increase. Nationally, though, a website where people can report hate crime online has seen an increase. From Manchester to Margate, though, in places where there are large numbers of immigrants, a sense of nervousness and uncertainty. Being on the receiving end of one of these racist attacks is, of course, a deeply personal, painful affair. It is worth pointing out that what we're seeing over the last few days isn't particularly unusual. During times of national and international upheaval, there's always, unfortunately, a spike in the number of race hate crimes reported. And what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 days is similar to similar sorts of incidents we've seen over the last number of years. Whether it's the referendum or whether it's the barrage of anti-immigrant media coverage in the run-up to it, for some, the result has compounded a feeling of isolation, a sense of disconnection from the country they moved to. Take, for example, this elderly lady from Germany during a phone-in today.
Well, I'm so scared. I haven't been out of the house for 3 days because I don't know what to do.
Last night we broadcast images of England fans ripping up European flags and being racist. Secretly filmed during the European Championships. A minority spoiling it for the rest. We're out of the tournament. The minority, it would seem, still at it though.
Porrick O'Brien reporting and the man targeted of abuse on that tram was Juan Yasso. I spoke with him just before the programme and began by asking him how he felt about what had happened to him this morning.
Well, it was a bit of a surreal moment because initially it was just me asking those individuals just to watch their language. Obviously, it was really early in the morning. There was children about, and I could tell from other people's faces on the tram that they didn't really appreciate the language that they were using. So I thought I'd step up and say something, and I didn't really appreciate it either. And it's obviously escalated to what it has now.
I mean, obviously, you challenged these people, as you say, but would you advocate others doing the same, or is there a danger they might have got hurt?
Well, it's down to the individual to recognize if they're, obviously willing to challenge something. I mean, I knew myself that if I was going to challenge this, that I was probably going to be on my own, and I didn't feel threatened at all. But obviously, you don't know what can happen from a situation whenever you challenge anyone, because you don't know who they are, their background or anything, or how they're going to react. So it's up to the best interest of the individual just to make up their own mind on whether or not it's worth them challenging somebody.
I'm asking an American who's living here, and we're delighted to have you, I must say. But I'm just wondering whether you feel that it is the political atmosphere surrounding this extraordinarily tense issue of Brexit that created the atmosphere in which this happened.
I think there was an undertone there before this Brexit and the voting within the referendum, but I think the result maybe has pushed people to somehow justify that they think it's okay now to act out in this way, which obviously it's not. It's not acceptable in any terms, in any way, shape or form, because obviously people feel threatened by it, and people are coming here to contribute. And no matter what anybody says, they have that right to come here and choose to live here, and they shouldn't be discriminated for that.
I don't know how long you've been living here in Manchester, for example. Have you had a sense that there is a lot of racial abuse?
Not necessarily in this area. I mean, I've not been in Manchester very long, but I have lived in the UK for almost 18 years now, and I do consider this place home. And I've never really experienced that much. I have in the past, but I think this is maybe only the second incident in 18 years.
To all intents and purposes, then, you are British. So I'm just wondering, has this in any way affected your sense of your now homeland?
It hasn't affected me in any way, shape, or form, because I mean, I have a little girl here now, and this is now I consider my home. And I've got many friends here. I've got friends who I consider family. I know a lot of people here, and this place for me is now my home. So.
And you join us live now in Westminster as the Remain demonstration, which had gathered in Trafalgar Square, has now cascaded down Whitehall and is now outside Parliament. And this is a demonstration which was originally cancelled because it didn't have adequate police permission, and is now a spontaneous demonstration. It's very hard to say what the numbers are, but we'll keep you appraised. Now there were some signs of recovery in the UK financial markets today, led by sectors that have been worst hit in the past 2 days' trading: airlines, banks, property. This came as the Chancellor George Osborne warned that the UK faced further economic setbacks and said that there would be tax rises and spending cuts. Our business correspondent Helia Ebrahimi has this report.
You go in and do that piece.
They claimed they had an economic plan that was working, but today George Osborne's March of the Makers looked to be falling by the wayside.
Well, it's all in 2 days, yeah.
While the markets calmed, real businesses were demanding answers about how Britain's trade with Europe will survive. For Mr. Osborne, the message was to fight for access to the single market, something dismissed as cherry-picking by Angela Merkel in Berlin today.
I will be strongly arguing that we should try and maintain the closest possible economic ties in terms of our access to European markets, to the single market, for our goods and crucially for our services and crucially, looking around us here, our financial services.
A bit far-fetched, since the referendum centred on halting free movement of labour. But it seems the Chancellor, the business bosses and indeed even Boris Johnson are clinging to this rather disjointed strategy today. In the meantime, the real risks are being felt by the Chancellor's key industrial projects, some of which seem unlikely to survive. The High-Speed 2 rail link has a hefty £56 billion price tag and has faced hostility from more than 30 backbench Tory MPs. EDF's nuclear power station at Hinkley Point looks set to lose a sponsor if George Osborne leaves the Treasury, and it's not loved by Boris Johnson either. And the third runway at Heathrow could be doomed given Mr. Johnson's promise to lie down in front of bulldozers to stop it ever happening. But when the great and the good of industry met the business secretary, there seemed to be more questions than answers. Sajid Javid said the business of government would continue, but he also conceded he couldn't make any promises. And by the way, he was now also campaigning as part of Stephen Crabb's leadership bid. And then there was this, a script line borrowed from the Chancellor.
The UK is still a member of the European Union and still a member of the single market.
One pressing project is the rescue of Port Talbot. Thousands of jobs on the line and a £15 billion pension scheme at risk of having to be bailed out. Would the government keep to its promise on sorting out the scheme?
In terms of the financial support, we said in terms of if there's a viable plan that comes forward that secures the long-term commercial viability of the business, then it is possible for the government to help with both debt and equity on commercial terms. That hasn't changed.
And on the pensions?
We're now in the process of going through the responses to the consultation, and we'll come out in due course with what we may or may not be able to do.
The fear for unions and for buyers is that this shattered government will choose simply to do nothing.
Well, with all that noise in Westminster, the microphone is momentarily passed to Brussels. Now, that is a pro-Remain, anti-Brexit demonstration. It is so noisy that I've taken over from John just for a few seconds. Now, as we've heard, there's plenty of uncertainty as a result of the Brexit result, and that uncertainty is also spread to the UK's green policies. So what could Brexit mean for the green agenda here and also for global action on climate change? In a moment, we'll hear from Christiana Figueres. She was the woman who guided the Paris Climate Conference to its historic agreement this December. But first, here's our science editor, Tom Clark.
Lost in the gloom over Brexit or looking on the bright side? Well, whoever ends up in charge of keeping Britain's lights on might well find it's not as easy or as cheap from now on. Exhibit A, an empty field in Somerset, future site of Hinkley C nuclear plant. The financial and technical woes for energy giant EDF made the deal look fraught before Brexit. Now the £18 billion zero-carbon plant, a cornerstone of the government's infrastructure plans, looks less certain than ever.
I think there's a lot of sort of forces acting against that project, and it might not have happened anyway, but I think the fact that we're likely to see a change of Chancellor and definitely see a change of Prime Minister will give the government the opportunity to have second thoughts on that.
And we're running out of things that generate electricity. Coal plants and most old nuclear reactors are due to go offline soon. But what will replace them? The current government's energy policy was criticised as being confused and contradictory, but it just got a whole lot murkier.
When it comes to building offshore wind farms, solar parks, onshore wind projects, gas-fired power stations, then there's bound to be an impact on investor confidence, and people are going to want to wait and see what's going to happen to the UK economy.
If a post-Brexit government cares less about climate change, which many environmentalists fear, we may see less renewable energy.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
And by voting out of Europe, our commitments under the landmark Paris Agreement, which the EU signed as a bloc, are open to question.
We end this COP celebrating a new chapter of hope for the world.
Does post-Brexit Britain risk being less green than the one that signed Christiana Figueres' climate deal just months ago?
Although the UK has chosen to leave Europe, it cannot choose to leave the planet. We still need a flow of investment into clean energy in the UK. And one of the things that characteristically would undermine that is if we sign up to an international agreement that 190 odd countries have signed up to and then renege from it only a few months later. That looks like you become a very dodgy bet indeed.
The winning case Ms Figueres made to leaders in Paris was that building green infrastructure presented a huge economic opportunity. Britain within the EU would have been carried along that path. Outside, we have to choose whether to be part of it or not.
Well, a little earlier, John spoke to Christiane Figueres, who heads the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change, and he asked her reaction to Brexit and its impact on potential European involvement in climate change.
Well, you know what, obviously it remains to be seen, and I think we're facing 2 years of volatility, uncertainty, lack of definition, lack of decisions, because it will take probably 2 years to figure out how do you recalibrate all of this. Very operationally, I do think that the EU might have to, although we shouldn't jump to the conclusion that they would have to, but they might have to take a look at their target and see if Article 50 is actually triggered, then the absence of the UK, how would that affect the EU? And the UK would have to see also how it would be affected should it have a different relationship with the emissions trading scheme of the EU.
So the danger is politically that there is some kind of an infection. There is much unhappiness inside the European Union, in Holland, also in Hungary, Austria, all sorts of places, where one having gone, others might follow, and then what you fought for in Paris has no core.
Well, what we fought for in Paris is actually much larger than the European Union. What we fought for in Paris is a global agreement that encompasses 195 countries, including those in Europe and the UK. The beauty of Europe is that you do have a core group of countries that shared an approach, have been leaders, and have actually under the larger agreement, they have an agreement themselves. That, of course, is very helpful, but it doesn't mean that the Paris Agreement is going to fall apart, because the Paris Agreement is an agreement of all countries.
But doesn't that feel a very long way from the little house in the north, the little house in the south, in which a family is struggling to feed itself and trying to divine how it's going to go on? All this big stuff above all becomes irrelevant, and they're happy to go their own way.
But you see, if you take it up to the Paris Agreement, you have the same situation, okay? Because you have the Paris Agreement where all countries came together for a unanimous decision on one direction of travel without disrespecting the national interests and the national needs of 195 countries. So we do have to be able to do this. We have to be able to work at different levels at the same time.
Well, from the muffled sounds of Brussels to the mayhem and John in Westminster. John.
Well, now you join us here at Westminster in a thoroughly unexpected and unplanned situation where there is a major demonstration in favour of the EU. These people have been singing EU, we love you. I warned you, some of the placards have some swear words on them. But these are predominantly very young people. They are the sort of 18 plus, but very, very few older people here. And it's impossible to say how many people there are here. There was a planned demonstration to be in Trafalgar Square. That was called off because it didn't have adequate police permission. And this has now developed in its stead. And I think we could certainly say there are some thousands of people here now outside Westminster in a place where you don't normally see demonstrations taking place. But there's a very significant pro-EU display of enthusiasm. So now, after the break, the Scots take their post-Brexit case for staying in the EU to Brussels.
A negotiating team is heading here to Brussels tomorrow, but it's not led by Boris Johnson or Michael Gove. It is, in fact, the Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Earlier today, she presided over an emergency debate in the Scottish Parliament and has now set up a council of experts to help guide what her government does next. With Scots having voted to stay in the EU, unlike England, she said that all of the options open to Scotland in securing its relationship with the EU needed to be looked at. Kieran Jenkins has this.
Lest you had any doubts about how much of Scotland is feeling. The European Union anthem, Scottish style. This could happen, Scotland stays in?
Absolutely, I think we should stay in, and it certainly is possible.
The Scottish mandate to remain in the European Union is absolutely clear.
Try telling people in Edinburgh earlier the result is binding. Are you wanting your cake and eating it here? UK voted out.
Scotland voted in.
Do you not have to accept the result?
I would say no, we don't, because Scotland didn't ask for the vote.
Well, as if the referendum result itself weren't enough, this is Scotland saying very clearly, we want to stay in Europe. How it happens, nobody seems to know. But something is stirring. In Holyrood, Nicola Sturgeon won a mandate to begin her own separate negotiations with the EU.
Tomorrow I will make an initial visit to Brussels to set out Scotland's position and interest to representatives of the major groups in the European Parliament and to the President of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz.
And so now Britain has two conflicting foreign policies.
In these contacts, we have again emphasised the overwhelming support in Scotland for staying in the European Union and the commitment of the Scottish Government to protecting our relationship with Europe.
But Scotland's path to staying in will be as bumpy as Britain's in getting out. As we stand right now, is there a route for Scotland to stay in the European Union?
No. I mean, the notion that there is, that there can somehow be a Scottish exemption, I think thoroughly misunderstands both how the United Kingdom works and, more importantly, how the European Union works.
Independence, of course, would change the dynamic. Nicola Sturgeon says it's an option if all else fails. And on that issue, Scotland is divided too.
You do not dampen the shockwaves caused by one referendum by lighting the fuse for another, nor by saying that the economic impact of leaving one union means you should sever ties with a greater union.
I want to be in a reciprocal, respectful relationship with partners. That's the key word, not bullies. And that's how the United Kingdom of Great Britain goes about its business. It's a bully.
I think a lot of people across the world have seen the Brexit vote as a very negative thing for the UK, and it's really had a negative impact in these first few days since the vote.
So how much % British do you feel after Brexit?
Absolutely zero.
It's just the first steps, but Scotland is trying to take control. Kieran Jenkins, Channel 4 News, Edinburgh.
Kieran Jenkins reporting. And you join us back here in Westminster for relatively unprecedented scenes here. There may have been 17 million people who did not vote this way, but there are demonstrators here on behalf of the 16 million who did. I've certainly never seen a pro-EU demonstration like this before, and Westminster's certainly not seen this sort of crowd in a very long time. But that's the scene tonight at Westminster, with the political parties imploding, the people demonstrating. That's Channel 4 News from Matt in Brussels, from me here in Westminster. That's Channel 4 News.